January 17, 1940. Washington, D.C. The winter air hung cold and damp over the Potomac as Vice Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto sat in the gallery of the United States Senate, his uniform crisp, his expression carefully neutral. He had come to America as part of a diplomatic delegation, but his true purpose was observation. Below him, senators debated appropriations bills with the casual disorder of men who believed themselves safe behind two oceans. Yamamoto watched them argue, gesture, laugh, seemingly unconcerned with the wars already consuming Europe and Asia. To the Japanese admiral, this chamber represented everything he had been taught to despise: democratic chaos, individualistic excess, industrial complacency. Yet something in the rhythm of those voices unsettled him. It was not fear he felt, but the first whisper of doubt, a tremor too faint to name, too persistent to ignore. He did not know it then, but he was witnessing the sleeping giant before it woke. For decades, Japan's military leaders had built their empire on a foundation of calculated assumption. They had studied Western powers with the cold precision of surgeons, noting every weakness, every moment of hesitation. They had watched France collapse, Britain retreat, the Soviet Union bleed. And they had looked across the Pacific at America, wealthy, yes, but soft. A nation of jazz musicians and factory workers, of Hollywood dreams and assembly line monotony. A nation that had retreated into isolationism after the Great War, traumatized by trenches and unwilling to fight again. Japanese war planners saw a country rich in resources but poor in spirit, capable of building cars and refrigerators but not warships and bombers. They saw democracy too fractured to mobilize, too comfortable to sacrifice, too diverse to unite. They saw everything except the truth. The miscalculation did not begin with Pearl Harbor. It began years earlier, in the quiet offices of Tokyo's Army Ministry, in the staff colleges where young officers learned that Japan's warrior spirit could overcome any material disadvantage. It began in the belief that industrial capacity was merely a number: steel tonnage, factory output, oil reserve, and that numbers could be defeated by courage, by discipline, by the willingness to die for the emperor. This was not empty propaganda. Japanese soldiers had proven it in Manchuria, in China, in every campaign where they had faced numerically superior enemies and prevailed through superior will. They had been taught that one Japanese soldier equaled 10 Chinese, 5 Russians, 3 Americans. They had been taught that the West had grown decadent, that democracy bred weakness, that comfort destroyed the warrior's edge. And then America entered the war. At first, the early victories seemed to confirm every assumption: Pearl Harbor, Wake Island, the Philippines, Singapore. Japanese forces swept across the Pacific with a speed that shocked even their own commanders. American battleships lay broken in Hawaiian waters. British colonial armies surrendered by the tens of thousands. The Dutch East Indies fell in weeks. For 6 months, the Imperial Japanese Navy ruled the Pacific, and in Tokyo, the military leadership allowed themselves to believe that the war was already won. They had struck the decisive blow. They had given the Americans a reason to negotiate, to accept Japan's great East Asia co-prosperity sphere and return to their comfortable isolation. But America did not negotiate. America built. The transformation began quietly. In the industrial heartlands Japanese planners had dismissed as irrelevant to modern warfare. Detroit, Pittsburgh, Gary, Cleveland, cities of smoke and steel that had spent the Depression years idle, their factories silent, their workers desperate. In 1940, unemployment still ravaged these towns. Men stood in breadlines. Families lost their homes. The Great Depression had revealed the dark side of American capitalism, the suffering hidden beneath the prosperity. Japanese observers noted this with satisfaction. A weak economy meant a weak war machine. They did not understand that those idle factories were not weakness, they were potential. When Roosevelt signed the War Powers Act in December 1941, he unleashed something unprecedented in human history: the complete mobilization of the world's largest industrial economy. Within weeks, automobile plants that had produced sedans and coupes retooled to manufacture tanks and aircraft. Shipyards that had built pleasure cruisers began laying keels for aircraft carriers. Textile mills shifted from dresses to parachutes, from shirts to uniforms. The Willow Run plant outside Detroit, built specifically to produce B-24 Liberator bombers, became the single largest manufacturing facility on Earth. A building so vast it created its own weather patterns inside. At peak production, Willow Run completed one bomber every 63 minutes. Not every day, every hour. In Tokyo, intelligence officers read these reports and marked them as American exaggeration, propaganda. It was impossible. No nation could expand production that rapidly. The numbers had to be false. But the numbers were not false. Admiral Yamamoto had tried to warn them. After his time in America, after watching those senators argue and those factories hum, he had written to his superiors, "With unusual candor, I fear all we have done is to awaken a sleeping giant and fill him with a terrible resolve." His colleagues dismissed this as the pessimism of a man too familiar with the West. Yamamoto had lived in America, had studied at Harvard, had walked the streets of New York and Detroit. He had become contaminated by American thinking, they said. He had lost the clarity of the warrior spirit. But Yamamoto had seen something they refused to acknowledge. He had seen the abundance. It was a word that appeared again and again in Japanese intelligence assessments, always with a tone of contempt. American abundance, American excess, American waste. Japanese soldiers were taught to revere scarcity, to find strength in deprivation. A true warrior could march 20 miles on a handful of rice. He could fight for days without sleep, without complaint, sustained by pure loyalty to the emperor. This was the path of Bushido, the way of the warrior, and it was superior to the soft American way that required 3 meals a day, coffee breaks, and weekends off. The Japanese military had turned scarcity into a virtue because they had no choice. Japan was a resource-poor nation, dependent on imports for oil, rubber, steel, and food. Every campaign was a race against supply lines. Every offensive had to succeed quickly because there were no reserves. Soldiers learned to strip enemy corpses for boots and rations. Sailors learned to stretch fuel supplies by mixing gasoline with alcohol. Commanders learned to plan operations around what they could carry, not what they needed. And then they faced an enemy for whom abundance was not propaganda but simple fact. American soldiers landed on Pacific islands with supplies that seemed impossible to Japanese defenders. Each GI carried more ammunition than an entire Japanese squad. They had portable radios, waterproof matches, cigarettes, chocolate bars, canned fruit, coffee, soap, toilet paper, mosquito netting, and spare uniforms. They had morphine and penicillin and plasma. They had trucks and jeeps and amphibious vehicles. They had air support on call, naval gunfire support, artillery support, supplies delivered by parachute and landing craft and submarines. When they ran low on ammunition, more arrived within hours. When they needed water, tanker trucks brought thousands of gallons. When they needed blood for transfusions, it was flown in from California. Japanese soldiers watched this abundance with emotions that shifted from contempt to confusion to despair. They had been taught that Americans were weak, that they could not endure hardship, that they would break under pressure. But what they saw was not weakness. It was a different kind of strength. The Americans did not need to endure deprivation because they had eliminated deprivation. They did not need to cultivate warrior spirit because they had mechanized warfare itself, transforming combat from a test of individual courage into an industrial process where superior logistics and overwhelming firepower rendered courage almost irrelevant. On Guadalcanal, Japanese troops starved while American supply ships arrived daily. On Saipan, Japanese commanders committed suicide while American engineers built airfields. On Iwo Jima, Japanese soldiers fought from caves with dwindling ammunition, while American force expended more artillery shells in a single day than Japan had manufactured in a month. The symbolism became impossible to ignore. Every captured American ration box was a sermon on industrial capacity. Every abandoned American helmet was evidence of an enemy who could afford to waste equipment. Every destroyed American tank was replaced by 3 more within a week. The breaking point came not in battle but in silence, in the moments after defeat, when Japanese officers sat in the ruins of their commands and tried to understand what had happened. They had done everything right according to the doctrines they had been taught. They had fought with courage, accepted death willingly, followed orders without question. They had embodied the warrior spirit that was supposed to make them invincible. And they had lost anyway, not because they lacked courage, but because courage could not defeat an enemy who arrived with unlimited bullets. By 1944, even the most fanatical Japanese commanders understood the truth that Yamamoto had seen in 1940. This was not a war between armies. It was a war between economies. And Japan's economy, its entire industrial base, was smaller than that of the single American state of New York. The shipyards of Japan could not match the output of Newport News alone. The aircraft factories of Tokyo and Osaka combined produced fewer planes per month than a single Ford plant in Michigan. The entire Japanese steel industry produced less tonnage than Pittsburgh. The Americans were not just winning the war, they were manufacturing victory on an assembly line. Japanese leaders had believed that democracy would be America's weakness, that the chaos of competing interests would prevent unified action. They had not understood that democracy in an industrialized society creates a different kind of power, not the power of obedience, but the power of innovation. American factories did not just build more, they built better, faster, cheaper. Engineers competed to improve designs. Workers suggested modifications. The distance between laboratory and production line collapsed. The P-51 Mustang fighter that dominated Japanese Zeros in 1944 had not existed in 1940. The Essex-class aircraft carriers that swept the Pacific had been designed, built, and deployed while Japanese shipyards struggled to repair battle damage. The proximity fuse that made American anti-aircraft fire devastatingly accurate was developed by university researchers and mass-produced by radio manufacturers. Japan had mobilized a warrior culture. America had mobilized an entire civilization. The final revelation came with the atomic bombs, not in their destruction, though that was absolute, but in what they represented. The Manhattan Project had cost $2 billion and employed over 130,000 people across multiple secret facilities. Japan's entire defense budget in 1945 was less than the cost of that single weapons program. The bombs themselves were almost beside the point. What mattered was that America could dedicate resources equivalent to Japan's entire war effort to a single experimental weapon and still maintain overwhelming superiority in conventional warfare. The message was clear: Japan had been fighting an enemy with such vast reserves that it could afford to spend billions on a weapon it did not need to win. On August 15, 1945, Emperor Hirohito addressed the Japanese people by radio the first time most citizens had heard his voice. He spoke of enduring the unendurable, of accepting the unacceptable. But beneath the formal language was a simpler truth. Japan had challenged an enemy it never truly understood. They had seen the abundance and called it weakness. They had seen the democracy and called it chaos. They had seen the individualism and called it cowardice. They had been wrong on every count. The lesson spread through the ashes of Japanese cities like a wine through ruins. In the prison camps where Japanese officers awaited trials, in the occupation headquarters where American administrators distributed food, in the factories where Japanese workers began rebuilding under American supervision, everywhere, the understanding took root. The warrior spirit had not been enough. Courage had not been enough. Loyalty and sacrifice and willingness to die had not been enough. America had won not because it fought harder, but because it built more. And it could build more because its system, messy, argumentative, undisciplined, unleashed productivity that centralized command could never match. Years later, as Japan rebuilt itself into an economic power, Its leaders remembered this lesson. They studied American management techniques, American production methods, American innovation systems. They transformed defeat into renaissance by learning what they should have known in 1940, that abundance is not weakness, that democracy can be strength, that the true power of a nation lies not in the obedience of its citizens, but in the freedom of its factories. Admiral Yamamoto did not live to see this transformation. He died in 1943 when American codebreakers intercepted his travel plans and P-38 fighters ambushed his transport over Bougainville. But his warning had been prophetic. The sleeping giant had awakened, and its terrible resolve was not military valor or warrior spirit. It was something far more devastating: the systematic application of industrial abundance to the problem of war. In the end, Japan's leaders learned what empires throughout history have learned too late, that you cannot defeat an enemy whose capacity to produce exceeds your capacity to destroy, whose reserves outlast your resolve, whose abundance transform conflict from a test of courage into a simple mathematics of output. The assembly lines that built victory did not march or salute. They did not live by Bushido or die for honor. They simply ran 3 shifts a day, 7 days a week, building ships and planes and tanks and bombs until the arithmetic of war became irresistible. That was the lesson Japanese leaders finally understood, not in strategy sessions or battlefield defeat, but in the silence after surrender, when the bombers stopped coming because there were no more cities left to burn, and the factories in Detroit kept running anyway, building prosperity instead of weapons, proving that America's true power had never been its willingness to fight but its capacity to build. The giant had never been sleeping, it had only been waiting.